Cape Town pastor Oscar Bochart has been warned against using hate speech on social media. Bochart has received a sentence of 30 days suspended for 5 years after making anti-gay comments on social media. But the pastor is apparently unrepentant. For more on this, we are joined now by Gashwell Brooks of the Human Rights Commission, the South African Human Rights Commission. Gashwell, thank you so much for coming through. So I imagine that you welcome this suspended sentence. It is not really for the speech that the pastor made, and as far as homosexuals are concerned, but it is about contempt of court, in that he continued making these statements even after a settlement had been reached.
Exactly. Good evening to you, to Lasizwe. Well, the problem is exactly that, is that the South African Human Rights Commission had a mediation process with the pastor concerned. An agreement was actually reached with him that he wouldn't make these statements, these inflammatory statements, via social media any longer. He proceeded to continue to do that. We obviously monitored his social media after a complaint had been brought to us, and then we went back to court because the mediation agreement, the settlement agreement out of the mediation became an order of court. So which means that if he went against that mediation agreement, being an order of court, that would be in contempt of court. So we took him on an application for contempt of court, and that is the ambit within which this particular finding was made, was that now he's obviously facing 30 days imprisonment, suspended for a period of 5 years.
Will you continue to monitor? Because, I mean, from the comments he's making, he's still adamant that he was merely preaching the word of God.
Well, clearly, definitely. And of course, if he's found to be in contempt of court yet again, or if he finds himself, making these types of statements, these hate speech-filled statements about gay and lesbian persons, then of course we will take it back to court. And unfortunately, the pastor then faces imprisonment, because this particular sentence has been suspended for a period of 5 years, which means that if within the next 5 years he commits a similar offense, then obviously the imprisonment then kicks in.
I imagine, Gashwell, that it would be folly on our part to imagine that this pastor is in isolation, that there isn't a systemic kind of conversation to be had about religion and the whole issue of homosexuality. I imagine that you are monitoring this particular pastor, but you're very much aware of many other pastors at various levels in various communities across South Africa who are making statements that are at the very least questionable.
No, very true. And I mean, as you know, yesterday was International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia, which is an extremely important day, which specifically is aimed at tackling issues of this nature. And unfortunately, what we find, especially within the South African context, is that on a cultural, religious basis, a lot of homophobia, transphobia and biphobia is being experienced, and obviously also communicated and reinforced in this particular process. So what we're saying as the South African Human Rights Commission is that you are entitled to, you have the right to religion, belief and opinion, which is a constitutionally entrenched right. But that does not entitle you to infringe on the rights of others. And in this particular instance, what we have here is a pastor that's making public statements on a public platform that is obviously infringing on the rights of other individuals based on their sexual orientation. And that is what is of concern. We're not trying to dictate to the pastor what he's supposed to believe or not believe. What we're saying is hate speech within any particular context is not allowable.
And how does that conversation land with the religious community, for example? Because, you know, a lot of what they say, they justify based on what they read in the various texts that they would be reading. So you almost have that difficult balancing act between the right to freedom of religion and this, the rights of homosexuals to not be discriminated against in a democratic South Africa.
As you know, I'm the communications coordinator for the South African Human Rights Commission. I'm not a theologian, but at the very same time, theology doesn't teach us to be propagating hate speech. There is a very big difference between what theology then in terms of preaching. And a lot of the time, this comes under the guise of preaching sin. And we know that religion doesn't have a uniform idea or understanding of sexual orientation, of gender identity or expression, for that matter. But within the context where religion does speak out against it, it does not mean that religion needs to be filled with hate speech. We had a similar situation last year, remember, where we had the Grace Bible Church scenario with Somizi, where Somizi walked out. And he made it very clear, you know, his sexual orientation is a relationship between himself and his God. as opposed to then having hate speech being propagated by this particular pastor. And the same principle applies in this instance.
All right, I know that we didn't really canvass this issue, but it's the 10th anniversary of the xenophobic violence that took place in South Africa, and I'm sure I can throw this curveball at you because I know that you've been involved in various types of work that have gone on since then about the welfare of foreign nationals in South Africa. On the 10th anniversary, as the Human Rights Commission, where do we stand? Have we as a society learned those lessons that we were supposed to learn from the events of May 2008?
It's a bit of a curveball.
Absolutely.
But I mean, in all honesty, from experience, what we see is that there's still high levels of xenophobia, whether institutional or at a community level. For example, we have and this is something that the South African Human Rights Commission is working on very heavily, is, for example, the documentation around children. The children of non-nationals in this particular instance. Because what you tend to find is that the children are being pushed away and turned away from schools on the basis that they're not allowed to get an education, that they're not allowed to get state assistance through the schooling system. But that is a blatant lie. Because the Constitution, the provision for access to education applies to all within South Africa. So that is but one example. But then we also have this recent issue of tensions in KwaZulu-Natal where non-national traders have been told that, listen, you better close up shop and you better move out. That is obviously of serious concern because, again, there we see an upswell, an upsurge at grassroots levels within communities of xenophobic sentiments being put forward. The same happened also last year or the year before, where in Rosettenville and parts of Pretoria, again, we saw that non-nationals were being blamed for crime, and crime that is common to, that doesn't look at nationality, that doesn't look at class. So unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to be done in that space by all concerned, whether it be community, civil society, or business, or the religious sector. There's still a lot of work to be done.
Cashwell Brooks, thank you so much. I knew I could throw that curveball at you because I know you've been busy with that kind of work. He, of course, speaks on behalf of the South African Human Rights Commission.